Hi, everybody. Okay, video number 3. So Diana asked, what was it like walking into the area behind the wall, and do the buildings still look like a mix of bombed out and stark modern buildings? Yes, that is just yes. So prior to the wall coming down, the Soviets did very little work in East Berlin. Now, they did huge work of those buildings where Harris moved to, along the Stalin Alley, which became Karl Marx Alley, which is sort of like the Soviet incredible entrance to the city. And that's where, say, the Stasi headquarters was. But the central part of the city that butted up to West Berlin was relatively left unchanged. And when the Soviets came in 1945, they pretty much destroyed anything that the Allied bombing had not destroyed previously. They wanted the Germans to pay, and they ruined the city. So there was a lot of, even now, 40 years later, are we at 30 years later? We're at 30 years later. Even now, you can see the differences between East and West Berlin, and you can see these stark, huge Soviet-constructed buildings next to older buildings. And it's also true that when the communists came in, rather than refurbish the buildings, they took a lot of the external ornamentation off so that the floors would look the same. There was no longer a bel étage, that beautiful story, 2 above the street, where you were above the heat and the dust of the street, but not so high it was super hot. It had lots of, in the West, you can still see the ornamentation. Often in the East, that has been stripped away. So it is very interesting, even 30 years later, you can see. That said, though, that is beginning as new buildings are built. That differentiation is becoming more subtle. So there you go. Let's see, Vicky, I have a question about the punk band. Is that true that they let them cross the border along with a cultural minister? Okay, and also, did people send letters in code to friends and family in the U.S.? So your first question, that is absolutely true. And it was a division within the punk culture. So in order to get one of those certificates, and it was a license that you got, you had to kind of tamp down your music. You couldn't be as subversive as a lot of the punk bands were. But many punks felt that by tamping that down and getting their message across the wall, that was more powerful than just sort of singing to themselves in the East. So that is true. It was often sent a Stasi officer and a cultural minister, and it is also true that they would have liked those punks to stay in the West. Stasi declared war on the punks because everything about them fought the status quo, fought the regime, and they were an eyesore, and they wanted them gone. And if they had stayed in the West, the Stasi would have liked that. However, the punks really did not want to leave. They wanted their home to be better. That was also a part of punk culture. Punk in the East was very different than punk in the West, New York and London. Its roots were different, and its purpose was different. So it was fascinating to do that research, and I loved putting all of that in because really those kids showed phenomenal courage. Basically, the minute you didn't dress like you were supposed to, you were outside the system, and they were arrested constantly. The things they went through were quite extraordinary, and it was a sacrifice for their family. It also was not fiction that your parents could lose their jobs. I mean, which is why many parents, sort of disowned their children so that they could keep their jobs, etc. And if they had other kids, keep supporting them. So it really was an extraordinary decision to rebel in that way. And so it is true, though, that you could get a license and you could sing over in West Berlin. So let's see. Next question. Did people send coded letters to family in the U.S.? I believe they probably did. Every single letter out of East Germany was censored. In theory, every letter was read. So if you wanted something private to get to your family, you really probably would develop a code. Now that sort of broke down a little bit. That was, sort of in the early 60s and maybe mid 60s. In the 70s, there were developed other ways to get messages out. There were loosening on the direction your radio antenna could face. And so people started wiring messages out, that kind of thing. But originally, it would have been primarily through letters. Also, later, press were not searched. So people often hid things in film canisters it's true, in the heels of shoes. There are lots of different ways. People are very ingenious when they want to communicate, which is wonderful, sort of the human spirit, I guess. So there were probably thousands of ways that people got messages out that I didn't even discover. So there you go. And Rachel, I guess the final question. Let's see, when I saw you at a book signing, you look to have some maps printed out of Berlin. Do you mind showing them to us and giving us a lesson? I know as I was reading the book, I found myself. Okay, so we're at 5 minutes and 30 seconds. So my next video, I'm going to go grab the maps, if I have them, because as I said, I'm in Montana, but I might have them, and I'll share them with you. So just a minute.